Thursday night breaking news. It's on Intel. Intel stock is higher by about 6%. On news, the U.S. is going to, or maybe already has, taken a 10% stake in the company.
On August 2nd, 2025, President Donald Trump took to social media to announce a shock deal in which the US government would take a 10% stake in Intel. Intel once stood as the undisputed king of the chip industry. In the 1990s and 2000s, the Wintel alliance with Microsoft gave Intel a stronghold on the personal computer market. But then, the dominance would begin to crumble almost overnight. First, the smartphone revolution would come along, and Intel would be caught off guard by the revolution, having an outdated chip architecture that simply wasn't feasible for mobile devices. Then Apple shocked the world by moving away from Intel chips in favor of their own silicon chips. And then the death blow came when the AI revolution emerged and billions were flying around in search of chips. Unfortunately for Intel, it wasn't them who benefited during the AI revolution. Rather, it was Nvidia, becoming one of the most valuable companies in the world. In just decades, Intel had blown its near monopoly in chips. Today, the company that once defined computing is fighting to stay alive, with the American government even stepping in to save it from collapsing. This is the story of how things went horribly wrong for Intel and how America's last hope to make chips is a company well past its glory days. This is the story of Intel. The roots of Intel stretch back to a man named William Shockley. William Shockley was a decorated scientist and a Nobel Prize winner for co-inventing the transistor at Bell Labs. By the mid-1950s, Shockley was frustrated. Bell had become too bureaucratic. Shockley wanted independence and the chance to turn his transistor invention into an empire. So he would decide to leave Bell Labs and return to his hometown in California, where he founded Shockley Semiconductor Laboratories. At his new company, he recruited some of the brightest engineers of the time. But while Shockley was a brilliant engineer, the same couldn't be said of him as a leader. He subjected employees to lie detector tests and even tested their blood to screen for genetic defects. The work environment at Shockley's labs were very toxic. In 1957, 8 of his brightest engineers staged a mass walkout. They became known as the Traitorous Eight. They would decide to start their own semiconductor company backed by a wealthy businessman called Sherman Fairchild, and they would found a company called Fairchild Semiconductor. Fairchild was a massive success, pioneering the integrated circuit and supplying chips for the space race, the Cold War, and the booming new electronics industry in the 60s. But success brought friction. The company's East Coast investors didn't understand the new work culture in California. Corporate oversight from the East Coast clashed with the fast-moving engineers in California who wanted the freedom to pursue whatever they wanted. The talented engineers felt stifled as the East Coast investors became increasingly more bureaucratic. Among those frustrated were Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, 2 of the original Traitorous Eight. Together, the pair would decide to leave Fairchild in 1968 to create their own company, Intel. At first, Intel made memory chips, but the real turning point came in 1971 with a chip called the Intel 4004. That chip would be the catalyst that would spark the personal computer revolution. The true brilliance of Intel's chips was how they fitted the entire logic of a computer onto a single piece of silicon. One of the first machines to take advantage of this was the Altair 8800, which was one of the first commercial personal computers ever released. It set the stage for 1977. This was the year that the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the TRS-80 made their commercial debuts. These 3 PCs looked nothing like the hobbyist-era personal computers. They came fully built with monitors, keyboards, and software, creating a far wider appeal for personal computers beyond just hobbyists. This newer, wider appeal of personal computers was so big that within the next few years, Apple would sell over 100,000 Apple II computers, eventually going public in 1980 at a valuation of $1.2 billion. But there was a problem for Intel. None of the 3 previously mentioned computers launched with Intel chips. Intel was in danger of missing out on the very revolution it had pioneered. That was, of course, until 1981 when IBM entered the PC market. IBM was a giant of computing, having a near monopoly in mainframe computers throughout the mid-20th century. Following the success of Apple and other personal computing companies, IBM had taken notice of the new industry and wanted a piece of it. For decades, IBM's name had meant authority and trust in the corporate world, so when IBM came out with its own personal computer, it immediately became the industry standard. And luckily for Intel, at the heart of the IBM PC was the Intel 8088 microprocessor. The IBM PC was a spectacular success. IBM's reputation for reliability and business computing meant that when it entered the personal computer market, corporations suddenly took PCs seriously, making it de facto the industry standard. By 1983, IBM had sold around 750,000 to 800,000 units of their PC. IBM's immense success, coupled with its PC becoming the industry standard, spawned the creation of a burgeoning clone market. Unfortunately for IBM, cloning their PC was remarkably simple to do. IBM had foregone its internal product development procedure, opting to use off-the-shelf, commonly available hardware to assemble its PC. This strategy saved IBM years of product development, but it also meant competitors could use the same off-the-shelf hardware to build their clones. To add to that, the operating system of the IBM PC was owned by Microsoft, which had the right to license it to other PC vendors, so cloners simply licensed it. And to complete the perfect clone, Intel also began supplying cloners with the same chips that were in the IBM PC, meaning virtually overnight, dozens of near-perfect clones flooded the market. The cloners would eventually boot IBM out of the PC market entirely and come to dominate the market. This gave rise to one of the most powerful alliances in personal computers, the Wintel alliance. Intel supplied the processors and Microsoft supplied the operating system. By the 1990s, Wintel was inescapable. Consumers no longer shopped for alternatives. They assumed every real computer was powered by Intel and ran Microsoft. So as the PC industry exploded, Microsoft and Intel were the biggest beneficiaries. While the PC vendors competed each other to death with razor-thin margins, Intel and Microsoft became monopolies of their respective markets, supplying the ammo for the PC wars. In 1980, Intel recorded a revenue of $1.1 billion. By the late 90s, that number had risen to $25 billion, with over $6 billion in net revenue. In 1999, its market cap surpassed $200 billion, putting it amongst the largest companies in the world. The Wintel alliance had turned Intel into a household name, but Intel's dominance didn't stop at the desktop. Behind the scenes, the company was conquering an even more lucrative market. As the internet exploded in the mid-1990s, businesses needed powerful machines to run websites. Traditionally, these tasks had been handled by expensive workstations and proprietary systems, but Intel had a weapon, the x86 architecture. With each new generation of processors, Intel chips had become powerful enough to challenge the specialized workstations of old. By the early 2000s, Intel had become the backbone of the internet. If you checked your email, shopped online, or browsed the web, odds were you used an Intel-powered desktop and your request was being handled by an Intel-powered server. By the late 2000s, Intel's chips controlled over 80% of the server market. For a while, it seemed unthinkable that anyone could dislodge them. It looked as if they were set to rule the chip world forever. By the early 2000s, Intel seemed untouchable. Their processors ruled the desktop, their Xeon chips ruled the server room. The Wintel empire looked permanent, but cracks began appearing in the armor. The first real crack came from a familiar rival, AMD. For years, Advanced Micro Devices had lived in Intel's shadow, mostly making cheaper copies of Intel's chips under licensing agreements. But in 1999, AMD unveiled the Athlon processor, and suddenly, Intel wasn't the fastest game in town anymore. Athlon chips beat Intel's flagship Pentium 3, offering more performance at lower prices. Then in the early 2000s, AMD struck again with the Opteron. It introduced 64-bit computing to the mainstream years before Intel had a proper answer. Tech giants like Microsoft and IBM started adopting AMD's architecture for servers, threatening Intel's stronghold on the very lucrative server market. Intel didn't take this sitting down. They fought back. The company gave secret rebates to PC makers that used only Intel chips and pressured manufacturers to limit or even cancel AMD-based products. These tactics kept AMD out of many big-name computers you'd see on store shelves, even when AMD's processors were superior. The strategy worked in the short term, but it came at a cost. The European Union hit Intel with a record antitrust fine of $1 billion. The company faced lawsuits and accusations of monopolistic behavior around the world. Just as Intel was grappling with AMD, an even bigger shift was about to blindside them, one they couldn't use their dominant market position to fight against. At first, it didn't look like a threat. Early phones were clunky, slow, and limited to calls, texts, and maybe a few simple apps. But when Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, everything changed. Intel had every opportunity to lead this shift. They had the money, the talent, and even an early low-power processor called Atom. But Atom was too power-hungry, too inefficient for the tiny batteries inside phones. Instead of adapting quickly, Intel doubled down on the markets it already dominated, desktop and servers, assuming smartphones would stay a niche. That bet was fatal. While Intel hesitated, another architecture was quietly taking over. Unlike Intel's x86 chips, ARM's designs focused on efficiency, small, low-power processors, perfect for mobile devices. By the early 2010s, ARM processors were everywhere in the mobile world, in iPhones, Android phones, tablets, and eventually billions of embedded devices. While Intel had missed the smartphone revolution, it remained dominant in the laptops and desktops market, all the way from Windows PCs to Apple Macs. Back in 2006, Apple had abandoned the struggling PowerPC architecture and switched the entire Mac lineup to Intel processors. Intel chips gave Macs better performance, better efficiency, and crucially, partial compatibility with Windows software. But behind the scenes, the relationship with Apple had begun to strain. Apple wanted smaller, more efficient chips that could keep pace with its sleek designs. Intel often couldn't deliver, and delays in new chip generations frustrated Apple's engineers. Meanwhile, Apple's iPhone and iPad teams were building powerful ARM-based processors of their own, chips that were beginning to rival what Intel could do. This would eventually culminate in the biggest announcement in the PC industry in decades. In 2020, Apple unveiled the M1 chip, its first in-house processor for its computers. The M1 delivered better performance and dramatically better battery life than the Intel chips they had replaced. Virtually overnight, Intel went from being the industry standard to a painfully outdated company. For Intel, the break was devastating. Losing Apple wasn't just about market share. Macs were a tiny slice of global PC sales. The real damage was symbolic. One of the world's most valuable and innovative companies had concluded that Intel was holding it back. And worse, Apple had proven that ARM-based chips could outperform Intel's prized x86 processors. They had already lost the smartphone market to ARM, and the architecture was now posing a serious threat to its personal computer business. Apple had shown that the future didn't belong to Intel anymore. On November 30th, 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT. ChatGPT demonstrated in real time the power of AI. Within 5 days, it reached 1 million users, and 2 months later, it reached an incredible 100 million users, becoming the fastest growing tech product of all time. Overnight, thousands of AI startups popped up, wanting to replicate the insane growth of ChatGPT. Every company, every investor, every government was suddenly scrambling to secure computing power to create their own revolutionary AI products that could capture a piece of a market potentially worth trillions. And yet, one company was almost absent from this gold rush. In theory, no one was better positioned to dominate the AI revolution than Intel. They had decades of experience designing processors, had unrivaled relationships with manufacturers, and had more influence over computing infrastructure than anyone. But instead of leading the AI revolution, Intel found itself watching from the sidelines. Because while Intel had spent years protecting its market share in PCs, another company had quietly built the foundation that was going to allow it to seize the future. Nvidia became as a gaming company company, building graphics cards for rendering 3D worlds. When the AI revolution started, people began realizing that Nvidia's graphics cards had a far more powerful application. Their massively parallel architecture made them perfect for training neural networks, the foundation of modern AI. What started as a niche use case exploded into the most critical hardware of the decade. So as the AI market grew, demand for Nvidia's tech also grew. Tech giants from Microsoft to Google lined up to buy tens of thousands of Nvidia chips. Intel, meanwhile, had tried to enter the AI market, but their efforts failed. Their in-house CPUs were too slow for AI training, and their GPU offerings were nowhere near as good as Nvidia. In 2021, Intel had hired Pat Gelsinger as CEO. Gelsinger was a veteran who had spent 3 decades at Intel, rising from engineer to chief technology officer before leaving in 2009. For many inside and outside the company, his comeback carried the weight of a rescue mission. His vision centered on making Intel into more than just a chip designer, but a foundry powerhouse capable of building chips for the entire industry. The plan was ambitious and required billions in investment. Luckily for Gelsinger, in 2022, the US government passed the CHIPS Act, a sweeping $52 billion package designed to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to American soil. For decades, Intel had been the pride of US chip making, but by the 2020s, the most advanced semiconductors were being manufactured thousands of miles away in Taiwan by TSMC. That dependence was dangerous for America. Tensions with China were high, and China continued to threaten a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. This made the US government concerned about having the most advanced foundries in the world be based in Taiwan. The CHIPS Act was Washington's grand plan to reduce dependence on Taiwan and bring back chip manufacturing to US soil, and Intel was one of the biggest beneficiaries of this act. But while the CHIPS Act gave Intel billions to rebuild, money couldn't erase the most pressing problem. TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea were producing chips at 5 nanometers and below. Intel stumbled at 10 nanometers. Pat Gelsinger insisted Intel could leapfrog back to the front, laying out an aggressive roadmap. In the end, Pat Gelsinger's revival never came. The gap with TSMC and Samsung remained, Nvidia's dominance grew, and Intel's market share kept sliding. On December 1st, 2024, Gelsinger was forced out of Intel. This brings us to 2025, with the shock announcement that America would take a direct stake in Intel. This means potentially billions more in federal funds are going to be poured into the company, propped up by the government, to ensure that the West isn't left defenseless in the global chip wars. With what we know about Intel's numerous and continuous failures, even with the full backing of the US government, can Intel catch up to TSMC and Samsung and save itself from what looks like an inevitable death? Time will tell. Thank you for watching.